Hey everyone, it's Jeff Young, kinesiologist, and welcome to my presentation on managing multiple sclerosis, considerations from a success story. In this presentation, I'll go through some basic pathophysiology and the stages of MS. I'll then quickly cover some research on the importance of progressive resistance training and some related physiological principles. And then from there, I'm going to use a case study, or more specifically, a unique success story to get my points across. So I'll give a little background on that. And then I'll dive into some important program design variables to include special considerations within the program design, followed up with some videos on some basic progressions and suggestions, as well as some typical workouts from the case study I'm using. And then I'll wrap it up with some guidelines that everyone should consider no matter where they are within the progression of the disease. So with all that said, let's go ahead and get started. Beginning with the pathophysiology of multiple sclerosis, MS is an autoimmune disease that affects the central nervous system with an unknown cause. And basically what happens is the immune system attacks and damages the myelin sheaths of the nerves, and because of that, nerve impulses are not properly conducted. Nerve axons become damaged, neural signals are either altered or lost, and hardened plaques can form within white and gray matter. MS has 4 stages that define the course of the disease. Stage 1 is called clinically isolated MS. It's the first episode of neurologic symptoms, which are caused by inflammation and demyelation in the central nervous system. Stage 2 is relapsing remitting MS, which is the most common disease course, and it's characterized by clearly defined attacks of new or increasing neurologic symptoms. And these attacks, which are called relapses or exacerbations, are followed by periods of partial or complete recovery or remissions. And during remissions, all symptoms may disappear or some may continue and become permanent. However, there's no apparent progression of the disease during the periods of remission. Stage 3 is called secondary progressive, which follows the relapsing remitting stage and is characterized by a progressive worsening of neurologic function and accumulation of disability over time. About 50% of individuals in the relapsing remitting stage will progress to secondary progressive. And the subcategories include active, which is defined by relapse or new MRI activity with progression in symptoms and or disability, active without progression in symptoms and or disability, non-active with progression, and non-active without progression. And finally, the 4th stage is primary progressive, which is characterized by worsening neurologic function, or in other words, accumulation of disability from the onset of symptoms without early relapses or remissions. And I just want to make sure to make it clear that the objective of this presentation is to use a success story to provide framework on how to manage or in some cases reverse the course of the disease and associated symptoms. But that this presentation applies to stage 2, relapsing remitting, and stage 3, secondary progressive, because I don't have any experience with primary progressive or situations where the person is non-ambulatory, such as being in a wheelchair. Although having said that, as I move through the presentation, you'll be able to see that most of the guidelines and suggestions that I give will apply to all stages of multiple sclerosis. So whenever you're talking about managing or hopefully reversing either the course of the disease or at the very least the associated symptoms, you have to do it within the context of the pillars of what's called lifestyle medicine. So no matter what the disease, and in this case we're obviously talking about multiple sclerosis, it's really important that you look at the following things. Is the individual getting adequate sleep? And if not, then you have to think about the changes that you can make or that the individual can make in order to improve their sleep, because it's so important in recovery and recuperation. It's also important to manage stress, to include the cessation of smoking if that applies. Obviously, we want to improve nutrition habits if necessary. And while it's outside of the scope of this presentation to go into any detail on this subject, since I'm using an anecdote as my primary way to get my points across within the presentation, I'd be remiss if I didn't at least say that in the story that you're getting ready to hear, the first step that was taken was improvements in eating habits. And while there's going to be varying views on what is the optimal approach, I think most people would agree that at a minimum, it's important to, at the very least, reduce the consumption of fried foods and fast foods, processed foods, sugary drinks, and replace those as much as possible with whole foods, fruits and vegetables, and water. And since nutrition is considered one of the top 2 pillars of lifestyle medicine, and since unhealthy nutrition is unfortunately closely related to chronic disease, this is going to be a primary component that individuals who suffer from multiple sclerosis are going to need to look at and make the appropriate changes and then be as consistent as possible with them. And then finally, and arguably the number 1 pillar of lifestyle medicine is exercise. And in line with the theme of this conference, this presentation is going to focus on strength and conditioning in the management of multiple sclerosis. So while I'm primarily going to use a success story as my way of explaining how individuals who suffer from multiple sclerosis should go about managing and controlling the disease, I wanted to start off by showing related research and science behind the management of multiple sclerosis as a way to support the anecdote and as a way to include science, objectivity, and clarity within the presentation. So the next several slides are about changes that occur in the nervous system with exercise and more specifically strength training. Examples of the changes will be listed in bullet points on the right side of the slides, and on the left side of the slides are associated articles which I would highly suggest that you review because it's really good information. Examples of changes that occur in the nervous system with strength training include firing frequency of motor neurons, rate coding, which is also known as the speed of contraction of the muscle fibers, recruitment of motor neurons, motor neuron synchronization, rate of force development, neural drive, intramuscular coordination, intermuscular coordination, and possibly most importantly, and one of my favorite terms, neuroplasticity, which is the ability of the brain to form and reorganize new neural connections, especially in response to learning or experience following injury and disease. I also wanted to include some journal articles of some studies and a systematic review, which clearly show that progressive resistance training has a positive effect on both strength and function in individuals with multiple sclerosis. I'll just pause here for a second so that you can read the titles of these 2 articles. And in this case, it's a systematic review. And then I included this article from the Journal of Applied Physiology, which is a short narrative review and also among my list of favorites, titled What Trains Together Gains Together. Strength training strengthens not only muscles, but also neural networks, which is a really important concept to understand for individuals who suffer from diseases such as multiple sclerosis that affect the nervous system. And I can really sum up the point of this article from a quote within it, where the author says, strength training results in a gain of functional neural connectivity, or more simply expressed, what trains together gains together. So it's important to understand that when you're strength training, it isn't just about strengthening and training the muscles, but you're also training the nervous system. And as you'll see in the following slides, in order to improve the health of the nervous system without the use of drugs and their associated side effects, it's critical that you actually train it, train as much of the nervous system as possible, and use strength or resistance training as a primary mode of exercise. Piggybacking off the last slide is another really important concept to understand as it relates to the health of the nervous system called Hennemans' size principle of strength. This concept basically states that motor units, and therefore the muscle fibers that are innervated by those motor units, are recruited in order of size, which is the reason why it's called the size principle, and they're recruited from small to large, from type 1 to type 2, which means that endurance fibers are recruited first, and then strength fibers are recruited if and as needed. The two primary mechanisms that determine the recruitment of motor units is both the load and the proximity to muscle failure. So what this means is that as the repetition range decreases, and therefore the load increases, the need to produce force is increased, and therefore the recruitment of motor units is also increased. And the only way motor units and the corresponding muscle fibers are trained is if they're recruited. Because if they aren't recruited, they aren't producing force, they're just at rest, and they're going along for the ride during the course of the contraction. And to be trained, some level of fatigue needs to occur, which is the reason why it's important to progress to the point where the individual is training to at or near muscle failure, where at least some level of neuromuscular fatigue is occurring. And the reason why I have the picture there with the individual and it's showing the nervous system is because it's really important to think of the nervous system as an electrical grid, that it includes the brain, the spinal cord, and then all the nerves that innervate the muscles throughout the body. And that in activities of daily living and exercise where the intensity is low to moderate, only a fraction of the nervous system is being recruited. More specifically, in the muscles of the lower body, it's really only 4 to 20% of motor units are being recruited during activities of daily living. And with endurance exercise, it's in approximately the 20 to 40% range, which means that approximately 60 to 95% of motor units are not being recruited and are not being trained during activities of daily living or aerobic exercise. Therefore, it's critical to include strength training as part of a comprehensive exercise program to optimize the recruitment, training, and ultimately the health of the nervous system. All right, so with all that said, we are now getting to the main part of the presentation where I'm going to use an anecdote to explain how to go about managing, controlling, and in some cases even reversing either the course of the disease or at the very least reversing the symptoms that are associated with multiple sclerosis. And the reason why on the slide you see the names Terry Walls and Saray Stancic, which you may be familiar with one or both of those names, is because I just wanted to use these names as a way to say that although I'm going to be using a case study as the primary way to get my points across, there are plenty of other people with multiple sclerosis who have similar stories, with Terry and Saray being two of the more popular examples. And the primary things they have in common are adherence to the pillars of lifestyle medicine, and more specifically, creating disciplined, healthy eating habits and disciplined exercise habits. And interestingly, their approaches have been slightly different, but the outcome has been the same, where they've reversed the course of the disease and significantly reduced or negated the need for medications. But this case study is going to be on the person that's far and away the most near and dear to my heart, my wife, Keturah. So I'll start by giving a quick outline of her story. Back in the beginning of May 2004, just prior to her 28th birthday, she started feeling really sick. And although she didn't tell me right away, she was experiencing severe migraines, nausea, and she was starting to lose the vision in her right eye. This occurred on a Thursday and Friday during a week, which were the 2 days that she didn't let me know what was going on because she thought that it might be related to her monthly cycle. But once the weekend rolled around, it continued to get worse to the point where she was struggling to get out of bed. And that's when she finally let me know what was going on and told me that if by the time Monday morning rolled around, she wasn't feeling any better, that she was heading to the doctors and not to work. That Monday was her 28th birthday. And by the time Monday morning rolled around, she was nearly blind in her right eye and continuing to feel horrible. So she went to our family doctor, who sent her to an eye specialist, who sent her immediately to the hospital. and she was in the hospital for the next 5 days being pumped with steroids to reduce the inflammation because she was diagnosed with optical neuritis or swelling of her optic nerve. And on about the second day of her hospital stay, after undergoing a bunch of tests, she was told that this is a classic symptom of multiple sclerosis, and that's what she had. At that point, our worlds were turned upside down. I hadn't really started working in a medical fitness atmosphere. At the time, I was training able-bodied clients in a traditional gym setting. And so from my standpoint, I didn't really know what to do. And we were both really uneducated on what it meant to have multiple sclerosis, other than to know that she had just been diagnosed with a progressive degenerative disease that puts a lot of people in wheelchairs. The next 5 to 5.5 years of her life were really bad, and her health was spiraling downhill. For the first 2 years after her diagnosis, she was placed on a medication called Avonex, which was a once-a-week shot, and her body was really rejecting it. She was having daily flare-ups that ranged from migraines and nausea, and her nausea included pretty regular vomiting and dry heaves, to restless leg syndrome, which was significantly affecting her sleep and causing accumulating fatigue. She was also experiencing her leg either locking up or going numb, flu-like symptoms, joint pain all over her body, and something called banding, which is a really intense and painful sensation of having a band around your chest or your rib cage, as though it's been placed in a vice and the vice is squeezing it. So after 2 years of these symptoms, which were getting progressively worse, she was placed on a medication called Rebif, which is a 3 times a week shot. And although it helped a little bit, the truth is it didn't help much. And it was really painful for me to sit back and watch and feel like I couldn't do anything. At about the 2.5-year mark is when I started at a facility called Mount Sinai Beth Israel Center for Health and Healing, which was a very comprehensive medical fitness facility. So I was finally working in an atmosphere where I was around clinicians, but it took another 2 or 3 years before I finally felt comfortable enough to place her on a structured exercise program. And even then, it was pretty conservative and consisted mostly of aerobic exercise and light weights. But somewhere around the 5 or 5.5-year mark, she lost a job because she was late for work all the time because of this restless leg syndrome that was significantly affecting her sleep. And it ended up being a blessing because when she got her next job, one of her colleagues suffered from multiple sclerosis. So she finally had someone that she could speak to about this. And the first piece of advice that she got was that she needed to clean up her diet. Katura was actually a little underweight at the time. She's 5'4", and at that time she weighed around 107 to 110 pounds. So body weight or body fat wasn't part of her issue, but she did have a diet that had too many sweets, sugary drinks, and too much processed food in it. And once she started cleaning up her diet and replacing those things pretty much immediately with fruits and veggies, other whole foods, and water, she immediately started feeling better. And this motivated her to get on the internet and start doing a lot more educating. And in the meantime, I started taking advantage of the atmosphere that I was working in and getting more advice as well. And long story short, it got to the point where she slowly started weaning herself off her medications and replacing her medication with being religious about eating healthy every single day, staying hydrated every single day with about 20 ounces of water in the morning, 20 ounces of water in the afternoon, and 12 ounces of water in the evening. She also started including a regimen of all-natural supplements, and I placed her on a flexible, linear, periodized, progressive total body strength and conditioning program. And the result was that she went from having daily flare-ups that were getting progressively worse and honestly scaring the crap out of both of us, to having the situation reverse itself. And it was amazing to see over the course of time the frequency, magnitude, and duration of her flare-ups become less and less, to the point where over the last 7 years of her life, as she continues to get stronger and more conditioned, she's weaned herself nearly completely off her medications. The frequency of her flare-ups are about once per year at the most. The intensity is pretty mild, and the duration only lasts for about 20 to 30 minutes. So she's gotten to the point where she's stronger, more conditioned, and healthier than most people who don't have a disease. So with that said, I'd like to use the next several slides to explain program design guidelines to include special considerations for individuals who suffer from multiple sclerosis, and also use some videos so you can see some examples of what a typical workout looks like, and also so you can have an idea of some progressions, especially when it comes to lower body exercises such as static and dynamic balance, and some suggestions for strengthening exercises as well. So let's get to it. Now we'll get into the guidelines for program design. And I'll start by saying that all my clients fall into the special population category, meaning they suffer from either chronic disease and or musculoskeletal issues. And for all individuals who fall into the special population category, including those with multiple sclerosis, it's really just a matter of using your ACSM and NSCA guidelines as your overall framework, and then understanding the special considerations that you'll need to implement and insert within the program design for the condition or conditions that the individual suffers from. And I'll get into what I mean by ACSM and NSCA guidelines as the overall framework in some upcoming slides. But beginning with special considerations, with individuals who suffer from multiple sclerosis, it's really important to emphasize hydration before, during, and after the sessions, because being hydrated helps to regulate your body's thermostat, and many people who suffer from MS are at risk for becoming overheated quickly. The next special consideration is, especially in the initial program design, and potentially for the program design as a whole, rest periods between resistance training sets should be long enough to allow heart and breathing rate to return to at or near resting, which also reduces the risk of overheating. And then along with that, you just want to make sure that prior to beginning any working set, that not only has the heart rate and breathing rate come back to at or near resting, but that they feel mentally ready to perform the next set as well. It's also important to exercise in a cool environment, and especially avoid exercising in hot and humid environments, once again because of the risk of overheating. Since MS is a disease that attacks the nervous system, many times it affects the individual's balance and coordination, and therefore it's important to challenge these components within the program design, not only with traditional single leg balance exercises, but also with exercises that challenge dynamic balance, which you'll see in some upcoming videos that I've included in the presentation. And with MS clients who fall on the more functional end of the continuum, you'd want to think about progressing at some point to multi-directional lunges, because not only will this improve strength, but it will challenge and improve spatial awareness, joint stability, dynamic balance, and coordination. And then lastly, you want to think about the timing of medication as it relates to their exercise session. While this didn't apply to my wife, it's something that you would want to ask your client. And more specifically, just ask them if the medication they're on affects their exercise. And if so, then you can find out more detail so that you can ensure that the exercise session is coordinated appropriately with the taking of their medication. And now diving further into program design guidelines, it's critical that you use the ACSM suggestion to start low and go or progress slow. And more specifically, you want to apply this during the initial program design by keeping frequency, volume, and intensity low to ensure their body is responding properly, and then progress in small tolerable increments. The reason why I have the bullet point that says activities of daily living as a point of reference is because that's a suggestion in the ACSM's CDD-4, which stands for Chronic Diseases and Disabilities 4th edition textbook, which I think is a great suggestion. For instance, someone who's in a more advanced stage of MS, who tells you during the initial consultation that they get fatigued just by walking to their mailbox and back home, and tends to be active for only 15, 20, or 30 minutes at a time before needing to sit down and rest, is not someone that you'd want to start with hour-long sessions or expect that they'd be able to aerobically exercise for 15 to 20 minutes right from the start. So it's important during the initial consultation to get a sense of what they're currently doing for exercise, if anything at all, and if not, get an idea of their activities of daily living and use that as your point of reference. So we can break program design down into two categories. There's the initial program design, which is also known as the familiarization phase. And then once the familiarization phase is over, the second category is how are we going to progress the individual? During the initial phase, as I mentioned previously, we want to start low. So from a frequency standpoint, with resistance training, that's usually going to equate to 2 sessions per week with 2 or 3 days in between sessions. We want to strengthen every major muscle group in the body unless there's an orthopedic reason why you can't. And then I typically start all clients at 10 repetitions per set. And the only way that wouldn't hold true is if they're deconditioned to a point where 10 repetitions is too challenging for them, such as if I asked them to perform a bodyweight sit to stand and noticed by the 4th or 5th repetition that it was beginning to get challenging, I would stop them there and use that as their baseline. But otherwise, 10 repetitions per set is a really good place to start. And then the primary purpose of the familiarization phase is to determine their available pain-free range of motion, teach them names of exercises, proper form, the flow of a session, use RPE scales to determine their initial loads, and more specifically, on an RPE scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being muscle failure and with 7 to 10 equating to a working set, I would highly suggest that during the initial sessions, you choose loads for every exercise where at the end of the set, they described the set as feeling like a 4 or a 5, which technically is in the warm-up range. But during this phase, it's really important to keep them within their comfort zone and make sure that their body is responding appropriately without too much soreness, too much fatigue afterwards, no joint pain, and you can keep them at a 4 or a 5 RPE for a 2 or 3 week phase. And if their body is responding well, then you can increase the intensity and the load on each exercise so that the RPE is about a 5 or a 6, and then keep them there for approximately a 2 week phase before progressing. And then another characteristic of the familiarization phase is the importance of using verbal, visual, and tactile cueing to help establish mind-muscle connections. And then the end of this stage is determined by the client showing proficiency in movement and that you've progressed their RPE from a starting point of about a 4 or a 5 to loads on each exercise that equate to about a 7. And what a 7 means on a scale of 1 to 10 is that neuromuscular fatigue is truly starting to kick in, and you're starting to notice a fairly significant slowing of the velocity of movement. So to be clear, this means that initially when the RPE is a 4, 5, or 6, when each set is terminated, you don't want to see velocity of movement slow. So the speed of every repetition should look the same as the speed of each previous repetition. But as their fitness level is beginning to increase, as well as their tolerance to the loads, in most cases you want to get to the point where the sets are true working sets, which ultimately is determined by the slowing of the velocity of movement. Earlier in this presentation, I used the phrase taking people to at or near muscle failure. But I also want to be clear that with individuals with MS, you probably never want to take them to true muscle failure. And there's also probably not even a need to take them within a repetition or even 2 repetitions of muscle failure. But since a 7 RPE is defined within the 6 to 15 repetition range as terminating sets with approximately 3 to 4 repetitions in reserve, this is a safe intensity to progress to in most situations. Although I want to include as a caveat that I'm giving general suggestions and guidelines, and that ultimately you want to coordinate program design with their healthcare provider. And once the client has showed proficiency in movement and the RPE has progressed to about a 7 on a scale of 1 to 10, it's time to put them on a flexible, linear, periodized program and think about progressing them in small, tolerable increments. From a frequency standpoint, in a perfect world situation, this would mean moving the frequency of their resistance training sessions from 2 times a week to at least 3 times a week, and even 4 or more, depending on the individual. But this is obviously going to vary a lot from person to person. And from a set volume standpoint, you'd want to think about going from approximately 2 sets per major muscle group per session, and at 2 sessions per week, that would equate to about 4 sets per major muscle group per week, to an ultimate goal of at least 10 to 15 sets per muscle group per week. So once again, this is a perfect world situation, and it's not going to apply across the board, but it's a weekly set volume to at least keep in mind. Because for those clients that you're able to reach 10 to 15 sets per muscle group per week, you really increase the opportunity to optimize their adaptations and the corresponding improvements in their health. And then from a rep scheme standpoint, I'll start most people, and in the case of this presentation, this applied to my wife, where we started her at 10 repetitions per set for the familiarization phase, and then progressed her intensity to about a 7, or in her case, it was a 7 or an 8 RPE on her working sets, ensured that her body was responding appropriately, and then moved her to 12 to 15 repetitions per set for a 3 to 4 week phase. And the primary purpose of the phase was to increase strength within that rep range by the end of the phase, so that at the end of the phase, she was a little stronger with each exercise as compared to week 1. And what this does is it prepares both the body and the mind for the next phase, where you drop 2 repetitions, increase the weight accordingly, stay there for 3 to 4 weeks, with the primary goal of increasing strength at 10 to 12 repetitions per set, so at the end of the phase, you're a little stronger in that repetition range than you were in week 1, which then prepares the body to drop 2 more repetitions, increase the weight accordingly, and do the same thing at 8 to 10 repetitions per set. And then at that point, the coach can make an executive decision as to whether or not that's as low as they want to go, and swing back up around to 12 to 15 repetitions per set and cycle through it again. Or if they want to drop the individual to 6 to 8 repetitions per set for another 3 to 4 week cycle. And I also want to make sure that you keep in mind that in each repetition range, since we are not taking the individual to muscle failure and using the 6 to 8 repetition range as an example, you're terminating sets within the 6 to 8 repetition range, but you're choosing loads where they could have actually performed 8 to 10 repetitions. So objectively, these repetition ranges would be considered moderate, light, and very light, as opposed to heavy, moderate, and light, because of the fact that each working set is sub-max. In any case, other things that you want to consider once you've begun to periodize their program is that within the scope of a week, you want to make sure that you vary intensities so that some sessions are lighter and some sessions are a little harder. And what that might mean is that some sessions fall at around a 6 RPE, whereas other sessions might fall around a 7, 7.5, or an 8 RPE. Ultimately, this is going to be at the coach's discretion, but the point is that you want to ebb and flow not only between rep ranges, but also between intensities within the scope of a week, because you don't want to always go light, 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 nor do you always want to go hard, hard, hard. You want to give both the joints and the central nervous system a break within the scope of each week. And then another critical concept to consider, which would fall within the special considerations category, is a concept called readiness to train. And from a coach's standpoint, this is something that you can never fail at. In the scope of my 25-year career, I have absolutely made the mistake of flaring people up. And when I looked back afterwards as to why it happened, it was pretty much always my fault. And it pretty much always came back to the fact that I didn't ask the questions that you see on this slide. And because I didn't ask the questions, I didn't have enough information to know that I should have adjusted the session accordingly and reduced the volume, the intensity, or chosen different exercises, such as a leg press over a squat or a dumbbell press over a push-up, for example. And next thing you know, the client was feeling either lightheaded or dizzy or nauseous or having some sort of flare-up, all because I forgot to ask them the readiness to train questions at the beginning of the session. So it's really important to understand this concept, and it's really important to ask the appropriate questions at the start of every session without fail. So as you can see from the slide, the readiness to train questions include asking them, how do you feel? How did your body respond to the last session? When and what did you last eat? Because you want to make sure that they're fueled up. And while you want to make sure that you always keep them hydrated during the course of a session, it's still smart to ask at the start of the session, are you hydrated? So that you can get a sense of when the last time they had something to drink was. And then if applicable, you want to ask them if they've taken their medications. Are they on any new medications? If they also happen to be diabetic, you'll potentially want to ask them if they've taken their blood sugar. If they're hypertensive and it's not controlled well with medications, you'll want to take their blood pressure. And then you want to ask them if there's anything else that they'd like you to know prior to the workout. So while these questions do get a little redundant at the start of sessions, they're so important to always ask. And then the coach can make the executive decision as to whether or not to potentially terminate the session if the person's feeling too sick, or to reduce the volume and intensity, or adjust exercise selection based on how they're feeling going into the session. The remaining slides in this presentation are videos that I included so that I can give you a sense of what her workouts look like, some suggestions and guidelines for progressions, especially as it relates to static and dynamic balance and lower body exercises, and also to give you a sense as to how she has progressed from a fatigued and fairly deconditioned state 10 to 15 years ago to where she is now. So we always start sessions with trigger point release. While you don't have to do it that way, that just tends to be my bias. And I always start with a trigger point assessment on an individual just to get an idea of where their worst trigger points are so that I can individualize this part of the program. So this video is just to give you an example of how I go about it. Here she's doing the glutes and then the quads. An example of how she goes about her releasing her lats and her pecs. And then finally the QL. So I like to start people off with the basic leg swings, first from the front to activate the hamstrings, and then from the side to get the adductors going. Then maybe a butt kick against the wall or on a table if you're fortunate enough to have access to one. Here's a quick piriformis activation on a stool, or you could do it on a table. And then we call this a twist, reach, and thoracic extension, just as a way to get the spine going, as well as the shoulders. And then here's some single leg balance progressions, something simple like a standing on a stable surface or an unstable surface like an RX pad. Maybe include a forward lean. Or in this case, it's a forward and backward hop with a short hold. And then here I want to show progression, which ultimately is going to include a step down off of a Reebok step, which works force absorption, coordination, and some balance. And then ultimately you could do it off some risers if you want to increase the difficulty. And I also like to include dynamic balance for some spatial awareness by having them perform a slow walk at first, increase to a brisk walk, and then if they're able to, a jog. And then here's a slow grapevine walk to a more brisk one. And then ultimately a jog as well. But these are things that, once again, the coach has to determine whether or not the person is capable of this and they would want to be there as a spot as well. But I just want to give you some ideas of how we go about the dynamic warm-up along with various progressions. And then this video is just to give some suggestions on lower body progressions. And I'll probably stop the video a few times just so I can make sure that I get my points across. But in this first one, you're going to see how I go about assessing the depth and the ability of a person to perform a squat or a sit to stand correctly. And I always start them off with something that is too easy because I want them to experience success and not choose something that's going to scare them or cause them to lose trust in me. And also, her movement on the lowering portion is a little faster than I would have a beginner or someone who's deconditioned actually perform. But the point is to show you how I go about progressing people with squats, deadlifts, and lunges, since lower body exercises and progressions tend to be the most challenging for individuals with multiple sclerosis. So here you see I'm starting with a really conservative height, showing it from two different angles. I just want to make sure that they're pain-free, that their form is correct. And from the side, I'm just looking at their low back and making sure that no butt wink is occurring. And then I just consecutively or successively start to lower the depth and continue to make sure that their movement pattern is correct, that there's no butt wink. And once I get them to the point where they can squat with just their body weight in free space with proper form and we found their appropriate depth, at that point you can begin to load them up. And it's really just going to depend on the ability of the individual. If they're able-bodied enough to be able to use a barbell, then I'm going to go to that first. That's just my personal preference. But otherwise, you can load them up with a kettlebell or a dumbbell, like you see in this video. Or if you have access to a cable machine, you could go that route. And then ultimately, like I said, if they have the ability to perform a back squat with a barbell, then I would progress them to that. And then when it comes to deadlifts, I just wanted to show how I go about progressing someone so that they can eventually pull from the floor as long as they have the mobility and the ability to perform deadlifts by pulling from the floor. So for example, I might start them with a rack pull with just a barbell or some light weights added to the barbell. And although this next one isn't ideal, I just wanted to give you an example of how you might go about having the person pull from first higher than floor level and then slowly lower them as they gain the confidence and the ability and the strength to be able to pull closer to the floor, and then ultimately pulling from the floor. And then from there, you can just start loading them up. And then with lunges, you might want to just start them off with a stationary lunge. And I typically like to put them next to something that they can hold on to for balance if needed. In this case, it would be the cable machine. And then just start them at a range of motion where they have the strength and the ability to maintain proper form. So in this case, she's just tapping her back knee and coming back up in a much shortened range of motion. And then we take an RX pad away so she goes a little bit deeper. And then ultimately take that RX pad away so she's doing a full lunge. And once they get to the point where they can perform a stationary lunge with proper form, then you can start adding the stepping component, whether it's a backward lunge, a forward lunge, and then ultimately progress to walking lunges and multi-directional lunges like diagonal and side lunges. But once again, it's all up to the coach to make these executive decisions and determine what is appropriate for their client. But I just thought it would be a good idea to give some examples and some visuals so that you can see how I typically go about doing this with most of my clients, including those who are referred to me with multiple sclerosis. And then lastly, I included 2 videos. One is of a very recent lower body workout, and the other is of a very recent upper body workout, because I wanted to show you that here's someone who 10 and 15 years ago was having daily flare-ups that were progressively getting worse. She was extremely fatigued, moderately deconditioned, didn't have anywhere near the strength that she has now, and really was in a scary situation. And now at 44 years old, 5'4" and about 128 to 130 pounds, she's stronger, more conditioned, and healthier than most people of any age. And the most important things that I want you to know is that what's happened over the last 10 years of her life is that as her strength and conditioning have increased, there's been a consistent and progressive decrease and actually a reversal of the course of her disease and the associated symptoms. So with that said, here she is deadlifting 215 for 8. And I want you to notice with this lower body workout, especially with the multi-joint exercises, that despite the fact that this is heavy weight, relatively speaking, look at the velocity of movement of each repetition. And you'll see that although it slows down, she ends the set or terminates the set with some reps in the tank. So she's definitely increasing fatigue, but we are not taking her to muscle failure. She probably could have performed another 2 or 3 repetitions. And then same with the front squats. Here she's doing 115 for 8, but I want you to look at the velocity of movement or the speed of the movement of each repetition. And she's coming up with pretty much the same velocity on every single rep. It slows down a little bit towards the end, but she's terminating sets with a couple reps left in the tank. I'll speed the rest of this part of the video up, but this is a stereotypical example of a lower body workout. She likes to do hip thrusts. She'll vary the type of deadlift or the type of squat. She likes high bar back squats, conventional deadlifts, and we also do lunges or single leg press, but those tend to be on days that are going to be lighter in intensity. So on heavy days, we tend to stick more with bilateral multi-joint exercises like squats and deadlifts and take sets just a little closer to muscle failure so that we're terminating sets with about 2 reps left in the tank. And then on light to moderate days, it'll be things like barbell hip thrusts, multi-directional lunges, and maybe like a single leg press. And we'll terminate sets with more like 3 or 4 repetitions left in the tank. I'm going to include a video of a recent upper body workout, but I'm going to speed it up significantly for time's sake. Once again, we did a couple more sets within the workout that I'm actually showing on the video. But I do have her take sets with the upper body a little bit closer to muscle failure because it's not as fatiguing as with the lower body. But once again, please just understand that it's up to the coach to make these executive decisions and determine what's appropriate with the client. With her, and my suggestion is to start in higher repetition ranges with lighter weights, terminating sets a little further away from muscle failure and using your RPE scales as your guide. And then over the course of time, as the individual increases their strength and conditioning, overall fitness level, and hopefully they're starting to see a reversal of, at the very least, their symptoms, then you could potentially make the decision as to whether or not you want to start to train some lower repetition ranges, like at 8 or 6 repetitions per set. With her, we actually do go down to as low as 4 on occasion. And you can make the determination as to whether or not you want to go a little closer to muscle failure. So all eyes on a continuum of intensity and volume and frequency, and you just have to determine what is appropriate. But with her, it's gone from light workouts and low volume and probably moderate intensity to there are times when we go at it. There's always lighter sessions within the scope of a week. But if she's feeling good and having a good day, we definitely go at it to take advantage of it. I wish I had some before workout videos so that you could compare the before and the after. And I totally understand that she's an outlier and that this is not going to be typical results. But the overall concepts are going to apply to pretty much everybody. And one of the points of all this is that the tortoise wins the race. The reason why she's progressed to the point where she's at, where she's deadlifting twice her body weight for reps, squatting 1.5 times her body weight for reps, and so on, is because I've always used RPE scales as her guide, along with the readiness to train questions, to determine the volume and intensity and exercise selection of each set, and progressing her within each rep range a little bit at a time, even if that means just adding another pound or throwing on a 2.5 pound plate. And when you combine that with her drive and determination to continue to get stronger and healthier and more fit so that she can battle this disease, the result is what you've just seen. So in conclusion, in many cases, multiple sclerosis can be well managed with the reduction or, in some cases, reversal of symptoms. And the earlier you catch it and the more diligent the person is with their diet, their sleep, their daily hydration, and their overall exercise program, the more likely it is that you can really manage or reverse the course of this disease or symptoms. But even individuals in a more advanced stage of this disease are still going to want to think about the pillars of lifestyle medicine and look at each one individually and think about how they can go about improving each one. But this is a diagnosis that definitely does not need to define the individual. And I can tell you that when she was first diagnosed and released from the hospital after 5 days in the hospital, some of the first words that came out of her mouth were that she's not going to allow this disease to defeat her. And she's continued to use that as internal motivation to drive her literally on a daily basis. So I hope this presentation was informative. And please don't hesitate to email me if you have any questions, because this condition is a huge passion of mine, and I'd love to help out in any way I can. And thanks a lot for watching.